This is the inspiring story of a blind teenage musician who turned public humiliation into a life-changing moment. Rate this story out of 10. Comment where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Hey kid, how about playing something for us? I bet you know Happy Birthday. The sharp voice of classical pianist Gregory Vance cut through the marble acoustics of the Metropolitan Conservatory's Grand Recital Hall. A few scattered chuckles followed from the elite crowd, critics, patrons, and high society influencers all gathered for an exclusive charity performance in New York. Standing silently beside the glossy black Steinway grand piano was 16-year-old Elijah Morgan. He wore a modest dark suit and held tightly to his white cane. His face calm but unreadable. His music teacher, Mr. Bryce, had managed to get them both into the event with 2 last-minute passes. They'd arrived in awe of the architecture, but not expecting to become the center of attention. Gregory adjusted his silk pocket square and offered a rehearsed smile to the audience. At 45, he was a household name in classical circles, known for his impeccable technique and sold-out international tours. Tonight's benefit performance was for a youth arts fund, but his interest in the cause didn't extend much beyond photo ops and networking with donors. Elijah, though, was everything Gregory despised about modern inclusion efforts in the arts: unpolished, uninvited, and, in his eyes, unworthy of sharing the same stage. "Come on, don't be shy," Gregory added, gesturing theatrically toward the piano. "Let's show our generous patrons how their donations are making an impact." Ms. Elaine Porter, the event organizer, exchanged a nervous glance with her assistant. "That's not on the program," she whispered, but she didn't stop him. Gregory was the star of the evening. If he wanted to make a moment out of this, no one was going to intervene. Elijah breathed in slowly, his fingers gripping his cane tighter. No one in the hall knew he spent nearly 10 hours a day practicing on a beat-up keyboard in the basement of a local church. Or that at the age of 4, he could replay a full Mozart sonata by ear. Most importantly, no one knew that he was memorizing every word, every tone of Gregory's mockery, turning it into fuel. "Actually," Elijah said, his voice steady and unbothered, "I'd prefer to play something by Bach." Gregory blinked, surprised, then chuckled. "Bach? That's ambitious. What piece did you have in mind, young man?" "Partita number 2 in C minor," Elijah replied softly, but with complete certainty, though I imagine it might be a bit sophisticated for this audience. A heavy silence fell over the room. The ticking of the antique hall clock suddenly felt very loud. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably. A few raised their eyebrows, sensing that this wasn't going to be the casual bit of amusement they'd expected. Gregory's smile faltered just slightly. He recovered quickly. "Well," he said, voice a touch sharper, "our patrons are quite familiar with the great composers. You might want to reconsider who you're underestimating." In the front row, heiress and arts donor Vivian Lancaster leaned toward her friend and whispered, "How disrespectful. He should be grateful to be here at all." But Elijah stood tall, his knuckles no longer white on his cane. His body was still, calm. It was the calmness of someone preparing for surgery or war. Dr. Charles Henley, conductor of the Philadelphia Philharmonic, leaned over to the event host. "Maybe we should continue with the program," he suggested quietly. No, Gregory interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "The young man seems eager to prove a point. Let's allow him the stage for a moment. It might be enlightening." He strutted to the piano and sat down, playing the opening bars of the piece with dramatic flair. "This work isn't just about notes," he said mid-play. "It demands maturity, years of interpretive experience, pain, even something that only comes with age." What Gregory didn't know was that Elijah had spent the past 8 years, ever since the car accident that took his sight and both his parents, devoted entirely to mastering the piano. With the help of his aunt, who worked as a janitor at a local music academy, Elijah had studied hundreds of compositions using Braille sheet music and bootleg recordings. Not just how to play them, but the grief behind them, the historical context, the emotion buried in each note. As Gregory finished the intro, Elijah tilted his head. "You played that in D major," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Bach wrote it in C minor." Gregory paused, frozen for a moment, A blush crept into his cheeks. Obviously intentional. He snapped. I was testing his ear. Elijah nodded. Of course. Then you must also know that Bach composed this partita while mourning the death of his wife. Every movement expresses a stage of grief. That's why it demands more than technical precision, it requires lived sorrow. Some in the audience now sat forward. Interested. Vivian Lancaster furrowed her brow. Dr. Henley's eyes narrowed, watching Elijah more closely. Gregory laughed tightly. A bold theory. Well, since you know so much, why not show us? Elijah approached the piano and placed his cane gently against the bench. He slid his fingers across the keys like he was greeting an old friend. Then he turned his face toward the crowd. Before I begin, he said, can I ask, has anyone here ever lost something so dear to them that it left them completely silent inside? The air in the room shifted. It wasn't discomfort anymore, it was something heavier. People weren't looking for a spectacle now. They were bracing for something real. Oh, enough, Gregory said with a frustrated sigh. This is a performance hall, not a therapy session. You're right, Elijah replied, sitting down. Performance is important, so let's give the audience something worth remembering. In the fifth row, his aunt, Denise Morgan, watched him with a lump in her throat. She had seen this energy before his math competitions, before his solo church recitals. It was the calm before he stunned the world. Gregory scoffed. Do you want to play the piece or keep giving speeches? Actually, Elijah said, adjusting his seat, I'd like to play something slightly different. Something more instructional. Instead of partita number 2, how about I show the difference between playing music and living it? A few people murmured, surprised. Gregory's lips curled. Instructional? For this crowd? You think you can teach us something? I think I can, Elijah replied, his voice cool and clear. But first, let's remind them what playing notes sounds like. Gregory, now clearly irritated, returned to the piano. Fine, let's not waste everyone's time. As he began playing again, every note was precise, every transition flawless. It was undeniably professional, but also mechanical. Elijah stood nearby, eyes closed, cataloging every movement, not just the notes, but the phrasing, the dynamic shifts, the flourishes. He memorized it all in real time. When Gregory stood with a smug bow, the applause was polite. Now, he said mockingly, let's hear from the philosopher. Elijah stepped toward the bench and placed his hands on the keys. But before he played a single note, he turned back toward the audience one more time. What you just heard was technically correct, he said. Now, I'll show you what it sounds like when someone plays from a place no teacher can reach. He lowered his hands, and with the first haunting chord, the entire room went still. As Elijah's fingers pressed gently into the keys, a hush blanketed the room. The notes that flowed weren't just sound, they were story. They bled sorrow, memory, and resilience. Every keystroke seemed to pull back a curtain, revealing a moment of his past, a feeling long buried, or a question never answered. In the front row, Denise Morgan held her breath. She remembered the day Elijah had returned from the hospital. Eyes vacant, voice quiet. That was the day his world turned to darkness. But the piano had become his light. And now, here he was, not just surviving, but commanding a room full of people who had seen him as little more than a charity case. What the audience heard wasn't just partita number 2, it was Elijah's version of it. The first movement, composed by Bach to represent denial, came alive in Elijah's hands as something haunting and painfully honest. It wasn't a refusal to accept tragedy, it was a desperate, fragile attempt to hold on to something that had already slipped away. Dr. Henley leaned forward in his seat, his hand resting on his chin. Incredible, he whispered to himself. He's not playing music, he's channeling it. Behind him, Vivian Lancaster dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, unaware that tears had begun to stream down her cheeks. This wasn't the performance she'd come to see, but it was the one she would never forget. Meanwhile, Gregory Vance stood motionless off to the side, his arms crossed tightly. He tried to look indifferent, but his jaw was clenched. He could feel the attention of the room shift, no longer on him. No longer admiring his calculated perfection. They were leaning into Elijah's performance like it was breath itself. And as the second movement began, the room changed again. If the first had been sorrowful, the second was furious. The tempo lifted. The rhythms grew more jagged. Elijah's fingers attacked the keys with barely restrained intensity. It was the musical equivalent of screaming into the void, of begging the universe for answers and hearing nothing in return. This was the anger he had carried for years. The rage at a world that took his parents, his sight, and nearly his sense of self. The fury he'd never been allowed to express, transformed into a force that made even the most stoic guests grip the arms of their chairs. Gregory swallowed hard. It wasn't just that Elijah was talented. It was that he was undeniable. Every flourish, every crescendo, every perfectly timed pause was a challenge to everything Gregory thought he knew about music. And about superiority. "You hear that?" murmured a man in the second row to his wife. He's telling us what it means to feel again." As Elijah moved into the third movement, something changed, not just in the music, but in the atmosphere itself. It was lighter, more reflective. The rage faded into something that felt like surrender. Not out of weakness, but of wisdom. The music didn't mourn anymore. It honored. Dr. Henley leaned toward Elaine Porter, the event organizer. "Cancel the rest of the night's program. We're not following this." Elaine nodded wordlessly. She was already texting backstage. Near the back of the room, a quiet young man in a Juilliard hoodie pulled out his phone and began recording. He didn't know who Elijah was, but he knew what he was hearing was special. Viral special. When Elijah finished the final note of the movement, his hands hovered over the keys for a long second, just breathing. Then, slowly, he lowered them into his lap. He didn't rise immediately. He didn't bow. He simply sat in silence, letting the music settle like dust in sunlight. Then he turned toward the audience, his expression open and unguarded. "I didn't come here tonight to prove anything," he said quietly. "I came because music saved me when nothing else could. When the world went dark, this," he gestured to the piano, "became the only thing I could see." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Elijah stood slowly, found his cane, and turned back toward Gregory. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," he said with sincere warmth, "for giving me the stage. Sometimes it takes someone trying to silence us, to show us how loud we really are." Gregory opened his mouth but said nothing. For the first time in decades, he was at a loss for words. As Elijah stepped down from the stage, the first pair of hands clapping came from Dr. Henley. Then another, and another. In seconds, the entire hall was on their feet. Not just clapping, cheering. Not politely, passionately. Vivian Lancaster cried openly. Elaine Porter, once nervous about Elijah's presence, now applauded like her life depended on it. Even patrons who had muttered judgments earlier were on their feet, eyes glistening. Gregory remained standing in place, frozen. His image, the maestro, the untouchable genius, had just been rewritten in front of everyone. Not by scandal, not by sabotage, but by truth. Elijah's truth. Denise met him at the foot of the stage, tears in her eyes. "You did it, baby," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "You didn't just play, you made them listen." "I had to," Elijah replied, "because someone once told me, the best revenge isn't humiliation. It's showing them what they almost missed." Outside the concert hall, a group of attendees gathered in small circles, discussing what they'd just seen. "That wasn't a performance," one of them said. "That was a reckoning." By the next morning, clips from the impromptu performance had begun to spread online. The video recorded by the Juilliard student reached over 500,000 views within 12 hours. Classical music bloggers were already dissecting the emotion in Elijah's phrasing. Articles were published with headlines like, "Blind Teen's Performance Redefines Bach and Humiliates Elite Pianist." Backstage, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Gregory sat alone in the green room, staring at the floor. A door creaked open. It was Dr. Henley. "Gregory," he said evenly, "we'll need to talk about your position with the orchestra. But not tonight." Gregory looked up slowly. "I just need to know." Henley continued, "What made you think he wasn't worthy of the stage?" Gregory didn't respond, because he knew the answer. And it was one he couldn't say out loud. By noon the next day, Elijah Brooks's name was trending across every major platform. Clips of his performance, especially the moment he corrected Gregory Vance's deliberate key change, spread like wildfire. The hashtags #Elijah plays truth and #blind prodigy began topping classical music and trending categories alike. Influential musicians, journalists, and even celebrities began reposting the video, praising Elijah's extraordinary performance and the grace with which he handled the humiliating setup. Meanwhile, Gregory Vance's carefully manicured reputation was unraveling. It was supposed to be a joke, Gregory muttered under his breath, watching the coverage from his Manhattan apartment. The news anchors weren't pulling punches. One commentator said bluntly, "Vance didn't just get shown up, he got exposed. In trying to humiliate a young blind musician, he revealed his own arrogance." Back at the Lincoln Cultural Hall, Elaine Porter was in the middle of a crisis meeting. "I don't care how much he's raised for this institution," she said sharply, pointing to the screen showing an article titled, "Gatekeeping in Classical Music: Gregory Vance and the Shame of Elitism." "We are not aligning our brand with prejudice. Should we cut ties?" a board member asked. Dr. Henley didn't hesitate. "Yes." Elaine nodded. "Make it official. Draft the statement, today." At the same time, in a small practice room at the Juilliard Pre-College Division, Elijah sat with his headphones on, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. Denise walked in, holding her phone. "You've got 2,000 emails," she said, half laughing, half stunned, "and a message from Yo-Yo Ma's manager. They want to meet you. Also, the BBC wants to interview you." From London, Elijah pulled off the headphones. "I just played the truth," he said softly. "I didn't think it would become this." "You didn't just play, baby," Denise replied. "You let the world feel everything you've been through, and they listened." Elijah nodded slowly. "Then I need to do more." "What do you mean?" "I want to make sure kids like me, kids who don't come from money, who have to fight just to be noticed, get the same chance." Denise looked at her nephew with a full heart. "And how do you plan to do that?" "I'll find a way." Across town, Gregory Vance sat in a conference room facing Dr. Henley, Elaine Porter, and several foundation members. The atmosphere was cold. No warm greetings, no apologies offered. "You brought disgrace to this institution," Elaine said flatly. "You humiliated a guest, weaponized your influence, and attempted to gatekeep the stage from someone clearly deserving of it." Gregory shifted in his seat, his voice dry. "It was a misunderstanding." "Gregory," Dr. Henley interjected, "the entire conversation is on video. The tone, the mockery, the manipulation. You didn't just doubt his ability, you tried to use your power to crush him." "He made me look like a fool," Gregory snapped. "That boy humiliated me." "No," Elaine said, leaning forward. "You humiliated yourself." Elijah just let his music speak. There was a long silence before Dr. Henley delivered the final blow. "Effective immediately. You are removed from the board of advisors. Your upcoming concerts at the Lincoln Cultural Hall are cancelled. And your invitation to mentor at Juilliard? Rescinded." Gregory swallowed hard. "That's it?" "No," Elaine added. "That's just the beginning. The media will do the rest." 2 weeks later, Elijah stepped into a new world. He had been invited to perform at Carnegie Hall for a special gala titled, "The Future of Music." It was a night reserved for prodigies, legends, and innovators. As he walked through the backstage corridor, cane in hand, he paused and took a deep breath. "You ready?" Denise asked, standing beside him in a tailored gown. Beaming with pride, Elijah nodded. "Always." His entrance onto the stage was met with thunderous applause. Sitting in the audience were some of the biggest names in music: violinists, conductors, composers, and even film scorers from Hollywood. And there, in the front row, sat Margaret Lancaster, the once dismissive patron who had openly scoffed at his presence weeks before. Now, her expression was one of awe. As Elijah sat at the Steinway once again, he placed his fingers on the keys, not to prove a point, but to continue a journey. "Tonight," he said into the mic, "I won't be playing Bach. I'll be playing a piece I wrote when I was 11. It doesn't have a name. It was just me trying to find something worth holding onto after the accident." He began to play. It wasn't technically complicated. There were no showy flourishes or theatrical gestures. But what it had, what every person in that hall could feel, was honesty. It was raw, vulnerable, and beautiful. Every note seemed to carry the voice of a boy who had once been lost in darkness. who'd found a lifeline in sound. The melody climbed and dropped like memories, sometimes joyful, sometimes painful, but always sincere. When the last note faded into silence, the audience rose to its feet. Another standing ovation. But this one wasn't about a viral moment or a social media backlash. It was about talent, about heart, about truth. Backstage, Dr. Henley embraced Elijah. "You're changing everything," he whispered. "I just want to play." Elijah replied, "No, you're doing much more than that." Meanwhile, in a quiet piano studio in Brooklyn, Gregory Vance sat with a student no older than 8. "Again," he said, but slower. The student nodded and began to play. Hesitantly, Gregory listened, but not like before. Not to judge, not to correct with snide remarks, but to hear. The fall from prestige had been swift. His contracts, endorsements, and invitations had all dried up. But in this small studio, Gregory was learning something he'd never truly understood before. Music wasn't a pedestal, it was a bridge, and sometimes, the only way to find your way back to it was to lose everything first. That evening, as Elijah and Denise walked the quiet path back to their apartment, Elijah paused. "Do you think he watched?" he asked. "Gregory?" Denise raised a brow. "Probably. I hope he heard it." Denise smiled. "He heard it, baby. The whole world did." 6 months had passed since the night Elijah Brooks played his soul into the hearts of millions. In that time, the world had come to know not just his name, but his mission. The once overlooked teenager from Brooklyn had become a global symbol of talent, perseverance, and quiet revolution. His Carnegie Hall performance had been rebroadcast on national television. Streaming platforms featured him as the face of classical's new wave. His interviews with the New York Times, NPR, and BBC Radio painted a picture of a young man whose story went far beyond tragedy, and whose music carried something audiences had been starving for: truth. But Elijah wasn't chasing fame. Instead, he used his spotlight to build something that would outlast applause. With support from donors, musicians, and even former critics, Elijah launched the Every Note Matters Foundation, a program dedicated to identifying gifted young musicians from underfunded schools and underserved communities. The foundation provided instruments, mentorship, and most importantly, opportunity. Margaret Lancaster, who had once whispered disdain from her seat at the Lincoln Cultural Hall, now served as the foundation's lead sponsor. "Supporting Elijah is not charity," she said in a televised interview. "It's penance. That boy reminded me what art was meant to do: heal, connect, and challenge us." Elijah's mornings now started in a different practice room, one overlooking Central Park at Juilliard, where he had become the youngest full scholarship recipient in the conservatory's history. His schedule was packed: private lessons, foundation meetings, rehearsals, but he always carved out time for the church basement piano where it all began. Denise still cleaned offices at night to help support the family, but now she did so with pride and a heart full of peace. Watching Elijah thrive was a reward beyond anything money could offer. One crisp autumn afternoon, Elijah stood before a group of middle schoolers at a community center in Harlem. He ran his fingers across a worn upright piano and smiled. "Who here thinks they're not good enough?" he asked. A few hesitant hands rose. Elijah nodded. "Yeah, I used to feel that way too. Until I realized, it's not about being good enough. It's about being honest." He played a short melody, one of his own, simple, imperfect, real. That's what music is for. It's not just to impress people in gowns. It's to tell your story when words don't work. The kids leaned forward, completely engaged. "Your voice matters," Elijah said, "even if you don't have sight, or money, or fancy connections. Every note you play is a piece of your truth. That's what people remember." Across the Atlantic, in Vienna, Elijah performed at the Musikverein, a venue once considered unattainable for someone like him. He played a program that included Brahms, Debussy, and one original composition titled Sightlines. The piece was haunting. Written as a musical journal, Sightlines traced Elijah's journey from the moment of the accident that took his vision to the night he reclaimed his worth in front of the world. It didn't shy away from pain. It embraced it. By the final note, the audience sat in breathless silence, then erupted into a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Watching from backstage was Dr. Henley, whose belief in Elijah had never wavered. He wiped away tears. "You are the reason I still believe in the future of classical music," he said as Elijah walked off stage. "Thank you," Elijah replied quietly. "But I'm just one story. There are so many more waiting to be heard." In a small classroom in Queens, Gregory Vance stood beside a 10-year-old girl struggling to get through the second movement of a Mozart sonata. "Slow down," he said gently, guiding her hands. "You're trying to impress the keys. Let them come to you." He was different now. Gone were the designer suits, the smug smiles, and the subtle cruelty disguised as critique. What remained was a humbled man trying to rediscover why he fell in love with music in the first place. He'd watched every performance Elijah gave, every interview, every speech, and though no one had officially banned him from the professional stage, Gregory knew his time there was done. He no longer belonged in the spotlight, but maybe, just maybe, he could help guide someone else toward it. Back in New York, Elijah stood in front of a packed audience at a foundation gala, preparing to speak. "I've played some of the greatest halls in the world," he began, "but no stage means more to me than the first one I ever stood on, the wooden floors of my aunt's church basement. With a borrowed keyboard and a dream." Laughter and nods rippled through the crowd. "When I was thrown on that stage at the Lincoln Cultural Hall, I wasn't there to teach anyone a lesson. I was just there to survive. But the music did something else. It forced people to listen, to more than notes, to the story behind them." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This foundation exists because of what happened that night. Because in trying to tear me down, someone accidentally handed me a microphone. And I decided to use it, not to shame anyone, but to shine a light for others who've been left in the dark." Thunderous applause filled the room. From the side of the stage, Denise dabbed her eyes, smiling. A year to the day after the infamous Lincoln Hall performance, Elijah returned, not as a +1, not as a charity case, but as the guest of honor. The same critics who had once doubted his presence now celebrated him. The same donors who looked through him now looked up to him. And Gregory Vance? He was watching the live stream alone, in his modest apartment, nodding with quiet acceptance. As Elijah sat at the piano and began to play the same partita in C minor, now entirely his own, the hall once again fell silent. But this silence was different. This was the silence of reverence, of reflection, of change. He didn't play with defiance. He played with freedom. Every note was a thread, binding the past to the present, pain to progress, ignorance to awakening. When he finished, he stood and faced the crowd with the calm dignity of someone who no longer had anything to prove. Because Elijah Brooks had done more than reclaim his voice. He had transformed an act of cruelty into a global invitation, for the world to listen not just with ears, but with heart. And that is what true music does. It doesn't just fill a room. It changes it. The end. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe to Tell Night. At Tell Night, stories remind us that healing begins with hope, and even the gentlest kindness can rewrite a destiny. Don't forget to tap the bell so you never miss a story that could brighten your day or transform your perspective. Until our next story, keep your heart open and your spirit brave.